Hi, I'm going to talk today about lead writing, but I want to talk instead of about just the basic news lead, which we did last time. I want to talk about other types of news leads. So if you recall, like you should have there was a PDF available last week or week before that had basic news leads. And if you, I stapled the first 4 pages of that, but it's a 7 or 8 page, I think it's an 8-page handout. If you went to the 3rd page on that, it should say leads that succeed, and it has a list of other types of leads. And so the basic news lead is the first of them, but there are a variety of types of leads. So I just kind of want to talk about how you don't always have to lead with just that kind of round up basic news lead. There are other types. The basic news lead probably works best for any hard news story, any story that has a strong news angle where you want to get the news out as quickly as possible. But sometimes with a little bit longer, we can have a little more fun with it. We'll talk about the news pyramid and how that came about in our next lesson. And so you can kind of see how the basic news lead works with that after you hear that lecture. But for the time being, I just want to kind of talk about other types of leads that work. And so one of the second ones that they list is the anecdotal or the narrative lead. And the anecdotal or the narrative lead is basically, instead of starting off with the lead, it starts off by telling a story. This is actually a really compelling lead type that as you get, you get the lead, but it's a story. So you're, instead of talking about, the city is voting to approve a tax increase, or, if you're doing something about, what's called the fair tax, but it's also, that's what it's being billed as. It's a desire for a graduated income tax here in the state of Illinois. You could start off with, suppose that gets approved, suppose it doesn't get approved. You could start off with a lead about that or a story about that. You could lead with that. Or you could tell a story about somebody who was impacted by it or that type of thing. You get to the people, you get to, very quickly. And so you start off with a story and you start with something like, if it passes and then somebody decides to leave the state, that's kind of the thing that most people are saying. So maybe you start off with, Joe and Sue, Smith are, already on the cusp about whether or not they can continue to live in Illinois. They find their property taxes excessive, the crime, blah, 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 whatever issues people have with Illinois. And then it says, but the final straw might be the increase in their taxes based upon the fair tax. And then you would go into what we call the nut graph. And I've told you about the nut graph. The nut graph is essentially just a basic news lead. It's just lower in the story. And so that's a pretty powerful, if I were going to tell you to use any lead type other than that, I would say that's probably the best. So some of the others are sort of similarities on the first one. There's also number 3 on the list is scene setter. The scene setter is where, you basically are just kind of trying to set the background. It's a Tuesday morning. There's a haze in the air. And the sun doesn't seem to be peeking through. The reason is there are fires burning on the West Coast that are causing smoke to reach even Illinois or something, and so instead of leading out with, residents will be seeing smoke or haziness because of that, you start off with kind of setting, what does it look like outside? And then you come into that. It's kind of a fun one sometimes if you go to an event, a rally, other things. I think just thinking about times I wrote, I remember one time I thought I was trying to get the story down quickly, but I was trying to come up with a lead for like, people returning from a deployment in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I remember I didn't get very many good interviews. And so I was just trying to capture the scene of everybody there cheering inside this hangar as the group landed. And so I started with a scene setter. I mean, that's kind of just, I had, crowds cheered, people cried, families embraced, and just kind of ran through setting the scene of what you would have seen there. Now, if you notice, the next one on that page, the 3rd page, is number 6. The reason is because this was in a book and they were together. So number 4 is on the next page. And so if you were to set those next to each other, it would look, you would kind of see how they they fit together. But number 4 is actually on the next page. So I'll just go in the order they have them. Number 4 is what's called a blind lead. A blind lead is essentially a lead in which you maybe play with the lead, where you maybe something is unusual and you're trying to have a little fun, where you're not telling them the full story. You're trying to hide things. There's a little bit of a lot of people who say, you know, part of the purpose of a lead is to get people to keep reading your story. And if you give away the whole story in the first sentence, they don't want to read it. And so a blind lead, to a certain degree, plays into that very well. It is essentially giving, it's kind of hiding the true story by giving you other things. Now, in this case, a lot of times that blind lead is maybe trying to play upon the fact that something unusual is happening. It's kind of setting an image and then maybe spinning it and saying, well, this is why that's happening. You know, one of the examples there is about, you know, the most valuable consumers in apparel business carry no cash, have no credit cards, and often spit up dinner on their new clothes. Infants and toddlers are leading it, is the next paragraph. And so, you know, there's a little bit of, you know, you kind of set a scene, you kind of get some interest, something kind of is just weird, and it's because you're not telling them the full story. Probably the blind lead I remember writing one time that I remember best was I did a story about a grade school cafeteria. I know this is big, hard-hitting stuff that had developed, or they didn't develop it, but they had moved over to, and when you paid for your school lunch, instead of, you know, going up and having a card or anything else to swipe, kids just put their finger on a little biometrics thing, just like you did on older versions of the iPhone. You just put your finger there, it realizes who you are, and it deducts lunch from your account. Now, with that said, I don't think that's even legal in the state of Illinois anymore, because you're not allowed to collect data on biometrics of students or anybody under the age of 18 anymore. But this was also 15 years ago when that was kind of new and that wasn't illegal. But that was how they did it. And so I said, I wrote a lead like, I found the kid, you know, whatever one of the kids' names is, you know, Billy Smith, you know, everybody's gonna be a Smith today, I guess. Billy Smith, you know, his biggest, most important transaction of the day requires the latest in technology. Not wanting to mistake him, his fingerprint is embedded into code, and when he places his finger on it, the transaction is completed. Billy is in first grade at so-and-so elementary school, and he's purchasing lunch. And that probably is the most important. I mean, that's the only purchase the kid makes on a daily basis. So, I mean, that's kind of the idea of a blind lead. You're kind of playing with that and having some fun, and then kind of in the nut graph revealing the bigger thing. The roundup lead, sometimes, like, you know, it's sort of an anecdotal lead maybe, or narrative lead, but it's realizing there's lots of people. So you're giving everybody's perspective. You know, if we go back to that fair tax thing, you could say, you know, so-and-so is considering moving, but so-and-so is considering whether or not they can even afford, diapers, paying the same, you can kind of look at everybody who's involved, because there's a lot of times more than one person or more than one perspective on this. One person's looking at this tax and going, I'm going to have to pay an extra $10,000. The other person's looking at it and says, I make $20,000 a year. This tax is going to reduce my tax burden by $500, which may not be a ton, but if you only make $20,000, $500 is a ton of money. And so, you know, you can kind of look at it from everybody's perspective and say, you know, this person's going to have this effect, this person's going to have that effect, this person's going to have that. And, you know, and then you say, and here's, you know, then you get into that nut graph of what's happening. All right, next one is, number 6 is direct address. So it's back on that previous page. Direct address is where you talk directly to the audience. Now, I would say I would discourage this one in general, because people don't like to be talked to in the sense of being told what to do, but occasionally it works. Sometimes with, especially a story that's more about maybe something like winter preparedness, or, how to, remodel your home. So maybe sort of those kind of like home or, lifestyle type stories. Sometimes this works better. But essentially it's saying, it's using the word you. We typically don't use the word you because we don't want to talk to people or make people feel like we're telling them what to do. But a direct address does work at times. So, you might say, you may be wondering how to convince yourself to wake up earlier in the morning. You may be wondering how you're going to get through this year with, remote learning and kids at home and blah, 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 blah. And I would say I would use that sparingly, but that is a form of lead. And usually you don't keep up that direct address of saying you, but it is sometimes an effective way with certain types of stories where the reason the person's reading this is because they're feeling this effect. And so I think a lot of times like home lifestyle, issues with, taking care of your kids and other things, people are going to read your story because of how it affects them. And so having that direct address doesn't hurt. The next is the startling lead. And it's basically where you try to kind of just grab people's attention by giving something that's really significant or startling. And so the example they have is like 1 in 4 Americans will be infected with a sexually transmitted disease at some point in their lives. That probably grabs your attention. It's also a true fact. And so, or it's used to be. And so, somebody, dug up a body or, hit somebody with their car. It's something that really grabs your attention. It's something that when you read it, you want to read that story because it's so compelling. So startling lead, if you have something that can startle people, definitely startle them. And then the wordplay lead is just sort of, something, this is one that a lot of people have fun with. It's kind of being punny, trying to, play on the language, do something like that. It has to be a feature. You can't do like, John, Killjoy is not, it has definitely had his joy killed this morning when he was murdered or something like that. That doesn't work. The Killjoys are not going to be amused by the fact that you use their name to talk about their person's murder as something funny. As a general rule, we're not 7th grade. Don't ever have fun with people's names. As a general rule, just don't do that. Okay. I guarantee you that, these people have heard these jokes before and probably, they maybe do it in good fun, but, it's not, it's not really like you're not nearly as clever as you think. So don't try to be like, hey, I'm clever, I came up with that. I have a former colleague who became associate vice president here at the College of Academic Services. His name is Jason Doctor. He got his PhD, and so everybody's like, hey, it's Dr. Doctor, and it's funny like once, but by the time the 3rd, 4th, 57th person says, oh, it's now Dr. Doctor, it's not really that funny. It is true, he is Dr. Doctor. I have a colleague named, colleagues named Dean, who I always thought, if they became a dean, it'd be kind of interesting. It'd be Dean or Dean, something like that. I don't know. And so, but don't play with those. Word plays better with things, maybe if there's just something, maybe a weird word or something else that makes it fun. I'll give you my best wordplay lead. Actually, it might be the best lead I ever wrote, which, that's I just always thought it was like a great lead. I was doing a story about I was in Peoria and it had been raining like every day. It was August and it had been raining almost every day. Just like felt like one of those times when it's like, are we ever going to be able to go outside without an umbrella? Is it ever going to stop raining? There was a thunderstorm every day. There was rain every day. It wasn't like constant, but there was a lot of rain. And so I called the National Weather Service and I said, we're just wondering, if this is an unusual pattern, I'm doing a story about it. And weather stories are usually, ones you get told to do by an editor, and you're usually, they're read, but they're also not particularly, it rains, it's sunny, these things happen, it's not like these aren't these are new events in your life. And so they're not necessarily always the most exciting stories to write. And so I called them up and they said, well, yeah, no, yeah, we've had a lot of rain the last couple of weeks, but it didn't rain a lot the last 6 weeks. And they're like, precipitation averages are built out of highs and lows. And so it might rain a lot for 3 weeks and then not rain a lot for 6 weeks. And they said, it really has been a pretty dry summer, but then the last 3 or 4 weeks has been extremely wet. And we've had a lot more rain, but overall the summer's on average. And so it's just a matter of right now, we're getting kind of inundated with rain, and it's more just a matter of, it just seems like a lot. And so realizing that, I wrote, Peorians may be feeling like they need to build an ark or something. I forget exactly how I started it, but that may be more a matter of perception than precipitation, maybe more a matter of perception than precipitation. And so that's kind of a nice, fun word play. Those words sound a lot alike, but it got to the core of what the issue was. And then they also have over here at the side on this page, they have some leads that maybe are lazy and leads that, you shouldn't try. And they have 3 types. The first one is the topical lead. The topical lead is basically where you're telling the topic. You're like, hey, the city met today to discuss taxes, or, the city council had a meeting and they discussed firefighters, or a group of parents got together and held a session on this, this, and this. You're just telling us what happened. I told you before, if you can write the lead before you go, it's not a good lead. If you're just giving kind of a topical, here's what's going to happen in this story, it's not a good lead. Get to the news. The next is the leads that don't work is a question lead. The question lead is where you ask a question. The problem with the question lead is, your job is to answer questions to a certain degree, not to get people to ask questions. I mean, they buy the paper for information, not for deep philosophical insights into whether or not, the city council is going to vote on something. They want to know if the city council voted on something. And so what happens is the question lead, it's a rhetorical device, and some people will do questions over and over again in their articles. So what happened next? When did that happen? Well, it's like with anything. I mean, it's kind of just, don't give the question, give the answer. I mean, people didn't come to read the question. They have a limited amount of time. They want to read the answers. As a transition device, as a catching device, it doesn't really work as well as you think. Now, it might work once in a while, and a question lead, every type of lead works once in a while, but as a general rule, it doesn't work. And it's the exception to the rule that makes it. There are certain types of leads that they work, but if everybody's allowed to do it, if everybody does it, then everybody's going to start leading with questions, and then everybody's going to pick up their paper or pick up their online app, and it's just going to be like question, 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 and they get tired of it. It really has to be a pretty rare exception. And by and large, people want to know the answer, not the question. It's said, people tend to kind of fall in, we try to avoid cliches, but there's also, it just reminded me that when I worked at a newspaper in Decatur, I was on the copy desk, and I remember one time, somebody, I think I did it, like my first time there. It was like an early Christmas story about, starting to get gifts or something, or, something. It was on the business page, and 'tis the season to start thinking about blah, 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 and I used a 'tis the season line in the headline. And I remember somebody read it and they said, oh, 'tis the season. Well, we've used that now for the year. And so, kind of, we had a rule that you could use 'tis the season one time for the entire year in the newspaper, and then it was done. And so once you used it, nobody else was allowed to use it. Now, we didn't have a hard, fast rule, but if somebody else came in with it, we'd be like, we've used this, and we'd mark it up. And the point of that all is a question lead is probably that same type. You think it's kind of like, oh, it's cute, it's 'tis the season, it's connecting Christmas with something, and yeah, but when everybody does it, it's like, 'tis the season for credit cards, 'tis the season for buying it, 'tis the season to get wrapping paper. It just gets old. And so the question lead is one of those. And then the last is the quote lead. And the quote lead is basically like, sometimes you go out and you get this quote and you're like, oh my gosh, this quote was great. The person said it perfectly, right? Now, the problem is when the person says something perfectly, it has context. And it rarely translates as well in print as you think. The other thing is even when they do state something really well, there's a good chance you can state it better. And so one is you don't want to have a lead that's a question that leads it and then it's like, oh, good quote, but you have to set it up and explain it afterwards. Because usually quotes work better after you've already set up and then you lead into the quote. Don't try to go right out the bat. The other thing I always tell people is in journalism, there's nothing wrong with having an ego. If you're the one who came out here and wants to write the story, you should have a sense that I'm going to capture the information and give it to people the best that I can, right? There could be 3 other reporters working out. There could be 2 or 3 people here who can write, and they could just write it up as a letter to the editor or post it online. Everybody. But the reason why you as a journalist are out there doing it is because you're going to go out, you're going to gather both sides, you're going to give the information in a clear, unbiased way, and you're going to give a fair account that's going to explain the issues very well, right? And so you want to have the first word. There's nothing wrong with having an ego and feeling like you can do it. And when you give a quote, I mean, my basic response is what, you couldn't say it any better? You're not any better than that, I guess? I mean, it's like, if you're good at what you do, if you're the best basketball player in the world, when it comes down to the last 30 seconds and you're down 2 points, you're not saying, hey, coach, let me get the bench warmed up for Joe while he gets in there and plays the game. You're like, give me the freaking ball and get me in, right? I mean, that's the way, there's nothing wrong with having an ego, and giving the lead away to somebody as a quote is usually just a bad sign that you've acquiesced to the fact that other people can do your job better than you. All right, so those are some other lead types. Try experimenting with them. There's some assignments, but I mean, those are just a kind of a handful of the options.